On September 14th, 2008, 5 p.m., the distinct sound of a giant metallic object that was probably a plane that must have fallen from the sky was heard by some locals who lived somewhere around the outskirts of the Russian city Perm. This sound turned out to come from an explosion, which was a direct event caused by the actually quite preventable crashing of the Boeing 737 of the Aeroflot Nord Flight 821. This crash killed all 6 crew and 82 passengers, which included Gennady Troshev, a Russian general who may or may not have committed war crimes, and a now former advisor to the Russian president at the time. This is the whole story. Before we begin, let me first give you a little background of the story to help you understand things a little better. So, this flight was one of the many routine domestic flights which comes from the Moscow Sheremetyevo Airport or SVO, going to the Perm International Airport or P. There would be a distance of approximately 700 miles, which would usually take around 2 hours depending on how fast your plane was. The plane here was a Boeing 737, which as of today is actually the most accidental and fatal and stupid airplane model of all time, with a total kill count of about 5,779 spread across 234 crashes. You may have actually even heard the recent news of this specific plane company doing some pretty shady things on this specific plane model. TLDR, this plane is pretty bad. As a matter of fact, the specific unit had a pretty janky throttle problem in which one engine would be producing more thrust than the other. This resulted in the pilots having to operate the thrust levers manually or leave it to the auto throttle, which is like the autopilot for throttle. Now the auto throttle has this sort of rule when if one of the throttle levers goes too far from the other, it would switch itself off, which it did multiple times already on the specific unit. The engines were actually pretty broken. To prevent this from happening, the maintenance crew would have to simply disable the system completely by simply switching off a circuit breaker, as they didn't have the parts to fix it yet. But for some reason they didn't do that and instead resorted to just telling the pilots that the thing was not to be used. Spoiler alert, the pilots in this flight forgot about that, but more on that later. The plane was owned and operated by a company called Aeroflot Nord, which is the regional sub-company of the biggest airline in Russia at the time, Aeroflot, which got rebranded in 2009 as Nordavia and in 2019 to Smartavia. Now, the problem with regional or local airlines like these is that safety really isn't or wasn't that much of a priority, something which will become evident later. Little human traffic and small profits led regional airlines like these to cut corners and make wee little compromises, which usually worked out without a hitch. Usually. Our story begins in September 13, 2008, 3:06 a.m. local time. Flight AFL 821 is taxiing towards the runway of the Moscow Sheremetyevo Airport. They are going to head off towards the Perm International Airport, or P, the airport from which they previously came. Inside the aircraft are 82 passengers of different nationalities, 4 flight attendants and 2 pilots, namely 34-year-old Rodion Medvedev, the captain, and 43-year-old Rostam Alaberdin, the first officer. The captain, Mr. Medvedev, has about 3,900 hours of total flight experience, which is quite low, especially for a captain, plus only 1,190 of those hours were even spent on the specific plane type, which was not ideal, as some planes don't usually have the same gauge types, measuring units and controls on their instrument panels, especially those that come from other countries. This is important because the rest of his flying hours are spent on an Antonov II, an old and quite outdated Soviet plane model. The first officer, Mr. Alaberdin, has a better flying high score of over 8,000 hours, which would make him a much more trustworthy pilot if only 7,000 of those hours weren't also spent on the same old Antonov II, which had some pretty outdated Soviet gauges. But the ADI, or the altitude director indicator, probably the most important gauge you could have in a plane, other than the actual windows, was where things really got confusing. Spoilers. You see, Soviet ADIs differ from Western ones in ways like how the symbols move. Western ADIs have a stationary crosshair symbol, which represented the plane, and the background would move around, and that's how you could tell what direction the plane was facing. Soviet ADIs instead had stationary backgrounds and moving crosshairs, an albeit quite small difference, almost unnoticeable really, but do keep that in mind later. Back to the story. At this moment, the plane had already taken off without a single hitch, except for a recently leaked SMS message from one of the passengers of the plane, which said that the captain's voice in the intercom sounded just a little bit funny. Kinda sus, but The plane was now well on its way to Perm, which I'll call P for the rest of the story because it's literally the official 3-letter abbreviation name. In flight, a few small but crucial things happened within the cockpit of the plane. I won't go into too much detail, but basically the pilots were breaking numerous crucial safety protocols, like talking about things other than what they should be, like flying the damn plane, or confusing the American units on the controls with Soviet or Russian ones. As for the autothrottle issue I talked about earlier, the pilots forgot about it. They were using the autothrottle anyway, which worked alright, surprisingly. It kept the engines balanced, that's for sure, but where there is thrust, there is trust, and as long as the autopilot isn't confused by all the goofy eyedness of the autothrottle, it will all work out, probably. Roughly an hour later at 4:50 a.m. local time, of course, the plane began descent onto the P airport. In the descent process, the pilot first had to radio the air control tower to give them a clear and easy path, which is to be chosen from one of the continuous lines from this and this confusing mess, which is basically a map of the air with imaginary paths in which one is to be chosen and followed by an incoming flight, depending on which direction they come from. The pilots were told to go down the Mendeleevo route, which is over here, which confused the pilots, especially the first officer, because apparently they planned a different route heading towards the runway, one that was easier and less of a hassle for them. The one that the air control gave them had to do a whole circle around the airport and then land. This was because another plane had to use the same runway. Now, for some reason, the captain's brain was not working properly, and he somehow got confused with the words of the air traffic control guy. It actually took like 10 minutes before the neurons in the captain's brain were activated. This was apparently because the captain was asking stupid, unimportant questions like, "What's the wind speed?" or something, almost as if he was drunk, and never even once asked of which end of the runway they were supposed to come in, which is one of the most crucial steps in this procedure. Eventually, the captain actually forgot to ask this question, which prompted the first officer to ask, "What direction are we coming in?" To which the captain replied, "I don't know, the air traffic control's probably going to tell us." The captain, after some actual thinking, then immediately proceeded to set the course, which was most logical, and which is also the same one the air traffic controller told him to set at the beginning of the descent. Unfortunately, the first officer was never told about this, which is not good. Now the plane was somewhat in course and slowly descending. The pilots then turned off the auto throttle and set it to 0, or idle as it's known. Of course they wouldn't turn off the engines, but for reasons a little too complex to explain, they turned the auto throttle back on, most likely because they were descending a little too fast. This action led to the thrust de-equalizing, because as mentioned earlier, it was broken and the auto throttle still had to calculate and implement the right amount of throttle to compensate for it. This made the plane tilt a bit, which had to be corrected manually with the rudder, which is what the captain did. Now, in those crucial moments of thrust confusion, a very bad thing has happened. They lost course. Well, actually, they were never in course, because it turns out the GPS compass thing on the plane was actually wrong, because apparently in cruise, the pilot kind of screwed up with the units and stuff while setting it up for the P airport, but back then it only had a difference of a measly few degrees. Now it was off by about 4 kilometers, and the pilots were absolutely oblivious. As to the other GPS compass thingy, because there's like 20 of them on a plane, it was supposed to be set by the radio broadcast thingy on the airport, but this had to be done on the plane, kind of like tuning radio. Unfortunately, the pilots forgot about this as well, and the GPS compass thingy was pointing at the right direction, because the right direction is the direction it points at when there is no direction. All this confusing and developing led the plane sailing over some random place almost outside the city, and combined with all the confusion of the pilots over the landing and everything, it all went to shit. The captain had accidentally taken a wrong turn because he was trying to adjust the tilt of the plane caused by the broken throttle. The plane was tilting to the left, and because of some very severe confusion between the pilots, he also tilted to the left. This was because of what I mentioned earlier, the ADI. The captain must have glanced at the ADI and most likely forgot that this one was different from the ones he was actually used to. Now, in his confused mistake, he screamed to the first officer, "Take it."
Bank angle.
Unfortunately, the steering wheel was bolted down pretty good, and the first officer could not take it. 5 seconds later, the plane had crashed just outside the city of which the P airport was in. Perm. The blast could be heard by nearby residents, who immediately alerted authorities of this giant metallic object, which was probably a plane, that fell from the sky. Everyone on board died. As for Airfloat, the reputation could never recover. Revelations from the investigation confirmed that the captain was in fact drunk and even sleep deprived. The first officer, though not drunk, did not know English that well, the language used in the Boeing 737. Today, Aeroflot and Order Flight 821 stands as one of the most stupidest and most avoidable plane crashes of all time.